Welcome to Forest FM. Today we have part 2 of our conversation between State Forester Matt McCombs and Dr. Tony Cheng. Tony is interim head of the Department of Human Dimensions and professor in Forest and Rangeland Stewardship in Warner College of Natural Resources at Colorado State University. He's also the former director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. Note that this conversation was recorded in November 2024, so some discussion around the evolution of land management agencies may have shifted in recent months. A quick rundown of what Tony and Matt talk about in this episode. They talk about the restoration mindset and the role of human values in forestry, the evolution of collaborative management and fuels reduction across the landscape, the role of narratives and challenges in getting support as management evolves. They talk about the irreplaceability of water in the West, and the implications for prioritizing resources in the wildland-urban interface. They also talk about the social evolution of narratives around conservation in the US and how it's changing. We'll mark the timestamps in this episode since it is a wide-ranging conversation.
Welcome back to Forest FM. I'm Matt McCombs. The scale of the impacts from 2020 and other fires that really led up to, going all the way back to 2002, right? The Hayman being sort of the godfather of our the shift of in thinking Colorado, perhaps. We are moving into what I would say is a season of acceptance. You know, when I first took this role, people asked me, what are your ambitions? And it was like a fundamental change in the nature of the forest forever. Right, through interactions, from human-caused interactions with the landscape. But secondly, and that's importantly, a fundamental shift in the way people see themselves in relation. And someone asked, well, what do you mean by that? I said, I have a dream, similar to you, that a county commissioner or any Coloradan is driving down a highway and looks, up and sees a single age, unbroken stand of trees and says to themselves, that forest needs some work. Right, that we somehow acculturate the entire populace of the state to embrace forestry and in the application of fire and the management effective management of fire into how we essentially do our business and how it and then the last goal really is the renaissance really of forestry practices. This idea that we resist the natural predilection, I think, of many Americans and certainly many Coloradans to sort of like Loraxify the concept, right? Like they just can't get past this idea of an unholy alliance between industry and a precious natural resource that represents more than just, wood available for production, for, making boards and making houses and such. And so I want to ask you this question around, there's been tension has been in the game here for the last, I'd say maybe 15 years around sort of restoration-based forestry. This idea that we are going to we're going to be able to establish in our minds and do so qualify and quantify scientifically the proper structure, composition, and function of a forest that would have existed prior to pre-Columbian, prior to European settlement. And I really embraced the concept early on as a line officer in the U.S. Forest Service, and I thought that was a moral as well as a scientifically rational way to move forward and to potentially bring people back into the forestry game and to establish the unique connection that we have as a country had to trees. What's the right thing to do as it relates to when we engage with forests through management? Do you wrestle with this tension between restoration-based forestry and sort of just the elemental keeping forests as forests in the era of climate change, which is, I'll be transparent, honestly where my mind often goes is, we are in a struggle for keeping Colorado a forested landscape.
Yeah, I mean, restoration, like a lot of terms that we use in forestry, and I think probably any field, is a conversation starter, like forest health.
Right.
It's a way to just open the door to a conversation for a lot of people, for elected officials, for general public. They don't need to know kind of the details of restoration. They just want to know that, are we making progress towards steering the forest away from the edge and into some kind of middle area? So one of my mentors in this world is Dan Binkley. Dan was the founding director for the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. One of the things he talked about was that forests have always had the ability to take lots of disturbances and still come back in kind of the relatively similar function and structure. He talked about it like a table. right? And so a forest can wander around over time, right? A very long table over time, and then wander over to one edge of density and species composition, and then gets disturbed, and then wander over to another edge. But it was always within some range of those edges. But as soon as it went over that edge, it was going to turn into something different. Nature doesn't care. It's us, right? And so, which is kind of why I like this, is that restoration is a human value. The very term of it represents a judgment. Right. And it's a very positive valence, right? Restoration implies healing.
It feels right.
So we've been doing that, right? In fact, in many ways, I would argue that forestry in the U.S. started out as restoration.
Yeah, I would fundamentally agree. And that's the history that I consistently try to reconnect people with. Like, we're actually really good at this.
I still like the term and the valence that restoration has in forestry because it is such an important part of the history of forestry in America. People that get into forestry want to care for the trees. We have majors in forestry, and if you ask every single one of those 20-year-old kids why they're in forestry, is that they want to do something that cares for the planet. Maybe the more problematic valence and definition of restoration was when the science of forest ecology really started to look at this table metaphor that Dan was talking about. You know, how forests kind of bounce around over time. Some people call it historic range of variation, natural range of variation. As a scientific concept, perfectly valid, right? And understanding what the natural range of variation of a species or an ecosystem is valuable because it tells us a lot about the endemism of its biodiversity and its coevolution with plants and animals and those kinds of things. Then what ended up happening in the late 80s and early 90s was that concept got translated into a management objective. That if we understand that this range of variation, then that ought to be that there's a human value judgment that says, well, that's good. A forest that operates within its historic range of variation is a good forest, right? Because it's able to adapt. All the plants and animals and all those good things are evolved to adapt within that range. We started seeing, especially out west, with fire exclusion and high grade logging and a lot of variety of historic land uses where a lot of forests were edging towards that edge or might have even tipped over that edge. In terms of its density, especially in terms of high density, maybe species composition towards drought intolerant, like fire intolerant species and those kinds of things, and therefore were more vulnerable. And when they did burn, then you saw tipping points. And so to pull those forests back from that edge, it became a management objective. A normative value thing says we ought to do forest management to bring them back from the edge. I still believe in that. I still believe that that's a good thing. I think the problematic thing that I have come more to a conclusion, especially after the 2020 fires. But even before then, I think 2020 was such a crystallizing moment for me, like down to a very emotional level.
I talk about being electrified.
Yeah, it was so disorienting. Even with the Hayman fire, right, 137,000 acres, uncharacteristic by any kind of historic record. It was still kind of anomalous. It was kind of like, oh yeah, that's the black swan. That was unusual. And then we all kind of fell back into kind of mental models of, a big fire is anything more than 10,000 acres. It was probably not in Colorado, but we started seeing very, very large, fast-growing fires in California, Oregon, in a lot of other places. Canada. It was like, okay, yeah, climate change is changing our fire environment. Our fire regimes are changing, and more research was coming out. And so intellectually, it was like the science was dependent on some predictable range of the types of fire and the climate under which those fires occurred. We are now in an anomalous climate, right? A novel climate.
Static mindset to sort of
exactly.
Dynamic
and
mindset.
So even the climate variation has now exceeded like all envelopes and all thresholds. And so how could we now expect that our fire and forest environments could not also change? If we put together all the puzzle pieces of how our environment is changing, and now our spruce, fir, and lodgepole pine forests that we have historically thought of as like long fire rotation forests, like fire intervals, 100 to 300 years between fires, are now moving to 50 years. And that's also because we have more human ignition sources, right? So we have human ignitions at all times of the year under any kind of condition. So at any time of year, we can have a fire that ignites and spreads. That's anomalous as well. And so if we can kind of forecast that happening, then we can use science to inform, well, maybe we ought to be thinking about our wetter and moisture forests that had conventionally been longer fire return intervals, and we ought to prepare them to have more frequent fires. What does that look like? Because once those fires burn through a lot of those forests, like we saw on Cameron Peak, there are large areas that have no regeneration because there's no more seed source. The fires burn so hotly. There was also a beetle epidemic that was 20 years before, and so you had the compounding effects of beetle kill and fires that just kind of eliminated seed source for a lot of areas. We're not going to have trees there. We have limited capacity to change things at that sort of forest landscape scale. So let's leverage the science we have to be able to come up with different management strategies for those forest types so that they can withstand and recover from fire, so that there's still trees left. There's seed source, those kinds of things. That's kind of where I've ended up. People would argue semantically that it's not restoration. That's fine.
I want to just use this discussion around restoration forestry to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your time at CFRI. The Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, part of the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institute, the enterprise itself was really rooted in crisis, right? It was born of crisis. The early fires in the 21st century, in the late fires in the late 20th, energized Congress to make investments to figure out ways that we could incentivize and then activate around fuels reduction. The ERIs were born from that ambition. And so maybe just talk a little bit about your experience and then the evolution of CFRI over the years. And the hard question I'd like to ask is, do you still see as a key output or deliverable for that organization and those entities broad-based fuels reduction related changes on the landscape?
The Restoration Institute model was established through an act of Congress in 2004. This was a time period where there were fairly large, major significance, high severity fires that had burned across the western U.S. In particular. And so one of the kind of founding logics was that especially for federal land agencies, that a lot of their own cultural and mental models of kind of forest management relative to fire was still fairly small scale. Just the ways in which people were doing planning and then implementing projects was very much in a kind of silviculture compartmentalized landscape rotational forestry approach. Even at that time, the science was pointing to you need to go bigger, in the sense that we need to assess, plan, and manage at the scale of the ecology. The SWREs were really established to try to accelerate that. Like how can universities that have histories of like extension and the land grant mission and extending research to managers and stakeholders kind of leverage their capacity to be able to do that? You needed some endurance and institutional memory, and communities don't go anywhere. And that was sort of another kind of thing that concept and value I brought to the institutes was to really do that collaborative learning engagement with the communities. One of the things that Dan, he recruited me to come into this position was, he said, this is not an ecology problem. This is a people problem. That's the reason why I got brought in. As we were getting going, we were still very anchored in that historic range of variation, kind of what we call a strict restoration model. For a lot of places, if you put fire into those areas, you might create more damage than you intended. You might have sent it off that table edge. And so going in and reducing fuels, reducing that fuel load. So as a technical term, right, fuel reduction and restoration and those kinds of, in many ways, they go hand in hand. Right. You can't have restoration. You can't restore the capacity of a forest to absorb and recover from fire unless you have done some kind of fuel reduction. The question is scale. So you take a 10,000 acre area, do you need to thin and treat every acre in that? Or can you selectively and strategically thin, maybe on the outskirts, maybe around some critical resources like water supplies? You may have a patch of old growth you want to do some work around. And then you can manage fire, whether intentionally ignited through prescribed burning, or if there's a wildland fire that ignites, you at least have options. If you didn't do any of that kind of fuel reduction work, you would have no options. You would have to stamp that fire out right when it started, or if it escaped initial attack, you would have to pull everybody back. You had no options. So in many ways, fuel reduction and forest restoration is about creating more options for the future. It's options for that forest. It's options for fire managers. It's options for those critical values that we care about.
I'll just be frank, that there's some political tension inside of that, because unfortunately, ideological poles end up grabbing hold of like those two sides of the spectrum, and then we get locked into, well, what are you doing here? Yeah. And what should we be doing here? How do you narrate that in a way that people can let go of those ideological poles and get to the center that will equal resources and support equal to the scale and the intensity of the problem we're trying to face?
The politics of this can be extraordinarily frustrating because those activities then get attached to narratives that people raise money on, right? No matter what side you're on. And they become almost kind of shorthand for like what side of it's either or. And I think the challenge for this enterprise, Matt, is that this is a long podcast. These are long narratives because it's not black and white. It's not you do this and the problem is solved. There's a lot of variation, and context matters, and places matter, and not everything is the same. And in the political realm, there's no patience for those subtleties and nuances. It's all black and white. I still have hope for collaboration because it is that dialogic, slow process. But you ask about like pace and scale. The pace and scale of social media and soundbite and sound clip, reality is much more concerning for me because it has now far outpaced the slow work of learning and dialogue that collaboration affords. So collaboration is really strung out by these two, like the sense of urgency of the climate crisis, but also the desire for simple black and white narrative sound bites. I go through these phases of kind of giving up. I've tried. I gave my time. I think I've moved the needle a little bit, but you just see the tsunami just swamps it and just washes it away. And yet, collaborators keep popping up. And that's the optimistic side of me, Matt, is that people have seen the alternatives and they're voting with their feet. It's like we're still going to work together because that's the only way we're going to solve this issue.
That's a really helpful sort of characterization of how we can explain to people what it is that we're trying to achieve, number one, and then how integrated the two potentially what they see in their minds opposing objectives are actually intricately linked. But it is magical when you're sitting at the table in those spaces and you've been at it for a minute and you see it click, and all of a sudden you have hope that we will be able to respond in real time. So you actually teased on a concept I wanted to get into as well. Is this, what's the right thing to do? A frequent challenge in forestry is this idea that what works in one set of circumstances, conditions, and in one place may not be ideal in another. We are blessed in this state with relatively not homogeneous, but well understood ecosystems in forest types. How do you tackle uncertainty around what's the right thing to do? And then if you've settled on that, right, how do you convince others that in fact you're right?
I don't think I've convinced, a unanimous consensus. But I think one of the things that is a lever point for me in conversation is the irreplaceability of water. The other thing that I learned from Dan, what is the thing that is the most irreplaceable in your ecosystem? And that's what you strive to restore and confer resilience to. You can't replace a water supply. You've changed the fundamental biophysical hydrology of a watershed. That watershed will function not the same for many, 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 many years. And that is probably the most critical resource we have in the arid West.
We don't grow trees in Colorado. We grow water.
Yeah. You go to some of these communities that were impacted by the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, right? Historically marginalized, Native, Hispanic land grants. One single water source got taken out by their high severity fire. They have to truck in water. If we can organize around the idea that what is it that we cannot replace, and how do we know that there are thresholds of severity and tree cover that we don't want to cross, right? The edge of the table. If we can define what we don't want, right? The undesirable condition. So we can start narrowing in what are those zones of agreement. The origins of the U.S. Forest Service was to protect water and watersheds from degradation. So I think there's a lot of potential to sort of reclaim and to assert that. I have gone back and forth with the wildland-urban interface in terms of the role and prioritization of funding and activity around those areas, mostly because of the evidence that we're seeing accumulated is that the vast majority of home loss is a result of grass fires or embers. It's not to say we shouldn't do tree density reduction and thinning and all that.
Parcel-based mitigations.
Yeah, or even like community-based and kind of having those buffer areas where you take the energy out of the system, you give firefighters an opportunity to backburn and all that stuff. But to say that, we are only going to spend money in those areas.
Or spend money there first.
Just about every place is wildland-urban interface. You have a power line. You have infrastructure. It becomes these very artificialized categories of what is right versus not right. The only thing that's unambiguous to me is the irreplaceability of water.
I think that's a fantastic place to anchor. And it's certainly one that we at the agency, and certainly I think forest practitioners anywhere in the arid West is wildly obsessed with for good reason. Because I think the threats are more real than they've ever been. And I think our ability to both first quantify and then qualify. We both know and admire Christina Burry, our deputy director, coming from Denver Water. She brings a certain sense of urgency that I can't even come close to matching, because she has spent over a decade obsessing over the vulnerability of our water supply, in particular that of Denver Water. You have just actually peaked in a very interesting sort of thought process in my head about where people have chosen to invest and make their sort of play in the forested landscapes is naturally dictating where we're investing resources first. And if you look at our composite map within the Forest Action Plan for the state of Colorado, if you look at the Wildfire Crisis Strategy Polygon, if you look at the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Programs priority areas, they are all tied to where people have established. Maybe I just would like you to tease that out a little bit. You go back and forth. You said, what do you go back and forth on? I think I understand what you're saying, that perhaps is there a part of you that thinks that we shouldn't potentially be prioritizing so many resources to these places where people have chosen to live?
I think we need to do a calculation of what difference do we think we can make to conserve and make resilient the values that we truly care about. If you look at those maps and how those maps were derived and the math behind them, the reason why places like the Colorado Front Range and Lake Tahoe and Sun Valley and Bend, Oregon, and Santa Fe pop up as those high priority areas is that part of that calculation is home values. Right? It's weighted to the housing density and the value of those homes. And so there's already we can talk about as almost like an environmental justice issue, that we are taking public taxpayers' money to fortify areas that already are an enormous amount of wealth and tax base and everything that goes along with high home values. If we really look at home loss and then link them with those polygons that have had a lot of treatments and put a dollar cost per acre to those treatments, have those treatments really made a difference?
I think it's a fair question, and it's one we wrestle with. Scarce resources, limited capacity within the context of the organizations that are tasked to this mission, and a deep desire to ensure that everything that we have, the limited resources that we do have and have garnered, are put to their highest and best use. So I appreciate teasing out a little bit of that inherent tension around what drives our decisions as it relates to where we place that emphasis.
And just as a taxpayer, but as someone who knows a lot about federal lands in particular, so I'll pick on like the U.S. Forest Service and federal lands, is that then when I see my tax dollars go to and have a chief and a leadership that says, we're going to do forest management to protect your communities, I want my forest management dollars to protect my watersheds and my habitats, right? And my recreational opportunities and the wild places. It's like Boulder can rebuild. Sorry, Boulder. I'm picking on you as an example. But those are different problems, right? Those are land use problems. Those are insurance problems. Those are building code problems. Those are not forest land management problems. And we are now at a point where we have conflated those, that the communities burning down is a forest conservation and management problem,
not a human development problem.
I'm very concerned about the fate and future of public forestry organizations, because those are making promises that you cannot keep. Under the right conditions, under the right wind alignments and those kinds of things, we will always have some level of home loss in those conditions, even with well-managed forests.
And we've accepted those impacts in other paradigms where natural occurrences are consistent enough and our histories and our memory is long enough that we attenuate our expectations. And people have actually made those leaps. They've talked about forest-based communities akin to coastal communities and the threat of flooding and hurricane versus wildfire. Where's the onus? Where's the responsibility? The insurance industry is making these calculations in real time and affecting change in ways that are really driving how we reimagine our engagement with the natural landscape that we are directly encountering and where we place development. I believe that there's value in engaging and making communities not fire safe but fire resilient, because I'm a believer in Dr. Paul Hesper. For listeners, as a researcher out of the Pacific Northwest Research Station, another academic, much like Tony, that I've been following the majority of my career, who talks about the models that suggest that the majority of forests in the arid West, so basically Canada to the Mexico border, from the coastal plain all the way to the Great Plains, they will all be impacted by megafire within the century, essentially. The challenge for us is to try to push that time horizon out by buying a new clock. He's talking about the ability to augment the nature of where these values at risk, these homes and communities exist, changing those forests so that they can be resistant to wildfire when it comes, so that we can apply fire and manage fire when it occurs, so that we turn the clock back, so that those conditions that we're creating conditions by putting fire back into the system, by having communities secured through mitigation activities and forest management activities, we might be able to buy a bucket of years in the future to continue to adapt in the face of climate change. And so, do you buy into that philosophy that by investing where these homes are now, we create the potential and maybe a public propensity to accept the management of fire or the application or prescribed fire more readily going forward, because that really it's the restoration of fire in Western ecosystems that's going to bail us out from the mass wasting that could occur in the era of megafire and climate change.
Yeah. I would buy into that if we had the alignment of jurisdictions, land managers, fire managers, and elected officials as kind of the sheath around that partnership, that at some point in the next 20 years, we will apply fire in those areas. If we're never going to apply fire in those areas intentionally or even through management, we can do forest management, we can, do thinning and for other variety of reasons.
Sure. But the resources are really around fire intensity reduction. I mean, there's very little appetite left, or at all, for traditional production forestry in the interior West. First of all, because the return interval in Colorado is bananas. There's no market solutions around that.
Yeah.
But there is a robust incentive right now with the investments that have been made to manage in these areas where these risks exist. The intention is to allow fire to restore itself naturally when that occurs, and that we apply it in those places where we can't stomach the risk associated with fire occurring on its own. And how do you get the public to buy into that? Right. It's where I'm really at. Because we talk in circles all the time about prescribed fire, and we all agree. And then the average resident who gets exposed to it, quickly gets out either ChatGPT or Google, and what comes back doesn't help them want to participate at all.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we just have to acknowledge right now, today, there's an upper boundary of where and how much fire we can apply on the land through management intention, whether it's through prescribed fire or a managed wildland fire, and those windows are closing because of climate change. Can we push those windows, further? Because I'm not a fire person, I could never speak on behalf of the risk that fire managers take. A colleague of mine who used to work at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Matt Thompson, still a very good friend, talks about this sort of stacking. Is that, what if you did 5 acres? That 5 acres can tie you into this road and this pond, this wetland. And then from that 5, then you can probably have another 50 acres. In combination, that might be enough. You don't need to do the whole 500. And I think that's that kind of crisis of imagination, is that in fire, we talk about all or nothing. We got to do all of it or we're not going to do anything. Right? And so you create a shelf stock, a linear shelf stock of burn projects. And it's we can't move on to that one until we're done with this one. Those are just operational. There's no law constraint. That's cultural. Then getting back to the social part is, if you can demonstrate that you managed a 5 acres prescribed fire well, and you had all the neighbors out there and you said, done. And then the next season or in another month or two, you can, you do that as a spring burn. You go back in the fall, you can do the 50 acres. Nothing bad happened.
You're tickling my sense of urgency. So does that match the scale and the intensity?
If you do that in enough places, if you got enough of those partners, and so so what you want to see in someone's dashboard on the Colorado Front Range is that if you did 205 little 5-acre burns all across, then you're starting to make an impact. It's an aggregator, because it's not, because those effects aren't linear to your fire risk, right? That 5 acres creates leverage for that, right? And so there is a fire physics, fire energy thing where it's again, to match the intensity and heat of a lot of these areas. But I can't see a world where tomorrow our friends and colleagues at the Division of Fire Protection Control and the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management are going out and going to light up 15,000 acres. I can see them going out and lighting up 150, and then in the spring burning 1,500. And county commissioners sitting around being like, okay.
These are the conversations I think that we need to have, and I appreciate you bringing those points up, because it's really, I think the opportunity for those types of experiments exist. I think there's actually enough energy and enough curiosity in the system to foment those opportunities. But the metric-based mindset is just really hard to break. We're shifting to outcome-based mindset in the agency, really defining a shared vision of the future and walking that back, defining those indicators that suggest to us that we're moving in the right direction. And so you are an educator. Your probably greatest legacy will likely be your students. The concept of conservation and the way we think about it is changing. There is a missing piece of the story around conservation, and it's really sort of, in my mind recently, it's been ensconced in at what cost and to who. And if we are shared in our mindset around the origins of conservation in America, how do you wrestle with integrating those changes into your own mind, and not only your own mind, but how you talk about the issues that you're paid to talk about?
Yeah, it's been a learning journey, and I think we have to acknowledge that that conservation, the designation of lands held in reserve by the federal government, either for national parks or for the original forest reserves or were otherwise national forests now, was a result of dispossession from the indigenous peoples. And so this narrative that really informs how we think about conservation and natural resource management and national forests and national parks and all these agencies, their origins is from stealing land. There is a thread now that's sort of, or a rivulet that's starting, that I think is gaining a lot of steam in terms of the idea of cultural burning. That we now know that for tens of thousands of years, the indigenous peoples on this continent and probably around the world used fire to manipulate the landscape for survival, for medicine, food, habitat, those kinds of things. And that kind of knowledge and that understanding, not only ecologically, but culturally, is one way in which to kind of relink that. So I think this fire story is one that has a lot of possibility for some restoration, some cultural restoration, if you want to call it that, but also ecological restoration, right? This biocultural restoration around restoring indigenous uses and practices of fire and really putting fire back in the hands of indigenous peoples. I also now think a lot about, and we, in our communities, especially our non-governmental organization, but even in government organizations, we have to ask questions about conservation for who. I'm going to pick on REI just because they're convenient and they can take it, and I think they're trying to do a better job. But the model of the REI consumer is the upper middle class, white, educated, urban, kind of metropolitan person that gets to afford $300 Gore-Tex parkas and state-of-the-art, camping gear. So they get to drive and pay $20 entrance fees to our national parks, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very exclusive thing. And yet that is not representative of America and where, the demographics are heading. I have been learning a lot more, and we have now a restoration ecology major in our forest and rangeland stewardship. It's our fastest growing major. And a lot of more and more of our students are interested in urban restoration, right? Restoring ecology and nature in places where people live, especially in lower resource and lower income parts of our communities, because they deserve nature and they deserve that connection as well. At the same time, we can both critically examine and celebrate conservation. I think we need to really evolve as a natural resource profession to be able to understand where society is heading and where the opportunities of engaging a whole new population and demographic about the importance of nature and the importance of conservation and management. And so that our profession, especially forestry, our demographics can start looking like the demographics of our communities. Because we're not.
Yeah, and I think that this is such an important conversation because there's so much tension. I think our willingness to engage in these topics, it just can so easily slide into the politicization of topics around inclusion. And not just inclusion in making welcoming spaces for people, but inclusion of different histories and inclusion of different narratives about shared history. And not just naturally going to, are you critiquing me? It's like, no, so I really appreciate the thoughtful sort of narrative around how we can have these conversations, and frankly, engaging with students and young people, this is effortless for them for whatever reason. I haven't totally put my finger on where they got this information, but it is effortless for them. I see it in my own college-age children, and I look forward to continuing conversations that are sticky like this, but also helping people that are in leadership positions like you and me in the space of natural resource management here in Colorado, but nationally as well, to get comfortable with that uncomfortable dialogue and to try to turn down the threatening instinct that might come from someone challenging what you might have relished. Because I got to tell you, I'm a Gifford Pinchot guy. Like I'm a Teddy. I mean, these stories captivated my mind, and I often talk about the public land experiment in America like is the most beautiful demonstration of democracy in humankind. But at what cost is the part that I wasn't putting into that rhetorical device. And so I appreciate that. I'd like to maybe just conclude this conversation with some open-ended questions about the future. It's no secret, and I think it'll become more apparent in the very near term, that the United States Forest Service is a crisis. The crisis right now is around resources and some sizable challenges around the budget. And there are some practical reasons for that, and then there are some unknown reasons for that. And I think those things will come to public view sooner than later. And because of that crisis around budget and the sizable shifts in perhaps the ideological mindset of the new administration, I would also suggest the agency is deeply vulnerable to reform. So if you had the ability to instruct or influence the transition team of the Trump administration as it comes online, what reforms of the U.S. Forest Service would you pursue?
I think it's important for any administration coming in, but we'll kind of stick with the current kind of motif of the day, is to really understand what are the core legal and regulatory missions of this agency. What is its basis of its founding, and how can it contribute to the well-being of the country and to the people, but also as kind of a beacon of what good stewardship looks like for the rest of the world. A is that we have a great foundation of science, that we have a research arm of the U.S. Forest Service, which is unique to any organization, to any government forestry agency in the world, and that management decisions ought to be grounded within foundations of science. I would want to empower line officers to be more risky. And I would want to evaluate forest supervisors and district rangers not on the outputs of, whatever acres or volume, but in terms of how many partners were they able to bring to the table in substantive ways, both in terms of substantively contribute to plans and implementation, and then assigning dollars to the dollars that they brought to the table. Because I think if you open that up, I think state and local governments and NGOs will come piling in to say, I invite you to be a partner in stewardship of these lands. You've basically created a structural incentive for shared stewardship.
I call that let go to let grow, because there's an inherent invitation from a willing line officer in the U.S. Forest Service or whatever to share decision-making authority, discretion, moving at the speed and intensity of the problem by cultivating relationships and buttressing your potential fear of failure by bringing others with you. I think it's fantastic. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to touch on is, and this ties to, I was a ranger for just under 5 years in Western North Carolina. The landscapes that were at the epicenter of Hurricane Helene's impacts was my old ranger district. And I can tell you with certainty that nobody in those communities could have conceived of the event that occurred and the damage that it did, that is going to augment, if not fundamentally change forever, the way these folks interact with those landscapes, the way communities that have been around since the founding of the nation are going to change forever. So I call that a crisis of imagination. When you think about Colorado and the arid West, what is our crisis of imagination?
I used to think it was, the big blow up. But I think with 2020, that imagination turned into reality. what I then often talk to folks about is, let's take the footprint of the East Troublesome Fire or Cameron Peak and overlay it on the rest of the areas that have yet to burn in the Colorado Front Range. And it's the entire Front Range. That's the crisis of imagination. These are anomalous things. I mean, in many ways, even with the home loss and, the acres that burn at high severity and all those kinds of things, if you took any one of those fires and you overlaid it over Boulder County, thousands of people would have perished.
Or been dispossessed. Or the Genesee Park fire, or the Coal Creek fire, or the Deer Creek fire.
So that's sort of one is still that this is still that's still in our future. Marshall fire, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be a forested fire, right? It could be, and I think Marshall taught us all those kinds of things, and I know that the state and elected officials and the agencies all understand that, but it's keeping that at the very front of city planners and civic leaders at that local scale. The second is kind of polar opposites. One is that we have in our historic range of variation records 50-year droughts in the Southwest. 50 years. That's not uncommon. On the flip side, we can go the other way. We could have the September 2013 flood events every year on burn scars.
Yeah, the Poudre River drainage terrifies me.
Yeah. And so, every time I drive up and down Highway 34 and I look at all the new, construction since 2013 and all that, I'm just thinking they're going to rebuild it again and again. I-70 closures after the Grizzly Creek fire. This was not a very large fire, and it actually was not that high severity.
There's like 14% of the watershed.
And it closed I-70, 6 times that summer. Every time it closed, somebody calculated it was like $60 million or $80 million a day in lost commerce.
Yeah.
That's the other extreme, right? We have those, right? We have those storm cells that just park over the mountains. And then if Hesburgh is right, and trends are pointing to it, if in a period of 50 to some years, most of this landscape will experience some kind of fire, and it doesn't have to be a large percentage of that watershed, we're going to have every single one of those rainstorms. Our infrastructure is just going to get hammered. That's going to tax everything, right? Road budgets, local county tax systems, infrastructure, repair crews, emergency service crews.
What keeps you hopeful within the context of both this wildfire crisis that we've discussed and this crisis of imagination?
I am fortunate enough to be in higher education, where I get to interact with young people from all over the world. And in our Warner College of Natural Resources, both in the program I'm in now, Human Dimensions of Natural Resources, my home in Forest and Rangeland Stewardship, our enrollments, we still have students coming through the door. Like I said, our restoration ecology major is our fastest growing major. That's what keeps me hopeful. And I walk into that classroom and we're in like the 12th week. We are in like the limping stage. I mean, this is the time of the semester when I'm just like limping, just crawling to the finish line. But our students still show up. They're still eager to learn. They see themselves as making a difference in this world. That's what keeps me optimistic.
Well, Dr. Cheng, thank you so much. You are a gem for Colorado. You're an incredible resource that we've been extremely fortunate to have all along the way. You've been an incredible impactor in my own land management career, and I never dreamed that we get to be colleagues. Yeah. And I'm so excited about that relationship, and thank you for taking time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for your leadership as director for the Colorado State Forest Service, our state forester. The energy you bring to your work and to your colleagues and your community, it's what's needed right now.
Thanks for listening. Visit the show notes to learn more about Dr. Tony Cheng and the topics discussed here. We'll see you next time.